The way Dennis Rader remembered it a few hours into his grilling by police, there had always been raiders in this section of the country. There probably always will be, he said. His ancestors came over from Bavaria back in the 1800s. Rader's kinfolk were good, solid people, working hard, farming the rich soil, trying to follow God's word as best they could. The family's name derived from the German noun Rad, which means wheel. The earliest raiders, it seems, were employed as wheelwrights. Dennis Lynn Rader was born in Pittsburgh, Kansas, on March 9, 1945, the oldest of 4 sons. He was also described as being born just outside the tiny town of Columbus, Kansas. Dennis was the first of the 4 sons of William, a former U.S. Marine, and Dorothea Rader. He was baptized at the Zion Lutheran Church in Pittsburgh, where his parents were members. Dorothea May Rader was a bookkeeper, and William Elvin Rader, a former United States Marine and Kansas Gas Service worker. His first 4 or 5 years were spent living on the wheat, dairy and cattle farm owned by his paternal grandparents, who also happened to be cousins, allegedly. Space was tight, as the entire brood lived under the same roof. Both parents worked very long hours and paid little attention to their children at home, and in later years Dennis said he felt neglected. His father was described as strict and God-fearing, but not abusive. He served as a Marine, and after his honorable discharge he landed a job at the Kansas Gas and Electric Power Plant, located about 10 minutes from the family's house. William worked long hours, sometimes pulling double shifts or working part-time at the graveyard. He also did maintenance around the plant and perpetually monitored the myriad gauges that sprouted out of the walls and pipes. Rader looked up to his old man. His mother, Dorothea, had a certain movie star quality about her. When she got dressed up, which she always seemed to for her job as a bookkeeper at Leaker's Family Foods, the neighborhood kids thought she bore an uncanny resemblance to Natalie Wood. To catch a glimpse of her sitting at her desk in the middle of the grocery, elevated up on a little platform above the floor, made them feel as though they'd suddenly been plunked down in the middle of a Hollywood movie set. The elder Raiders took their 4 boys to church and scout meetings, encouraging them to explore the great outdoors. They tried to do right by Dennis, Paul, Bill, and Jeff, although Jeff, as he admitted later, was a hellraiser. All 4 Raider brothers became Boy Scouts. They all liked to go for hikes and loved to hunt and fish. There are no recorded incidents regarding abuse in their family. Some neighbors even said they were a model family, always helpful, and the boys were raised properly. Rader often spent his summers at the family farm of his cousin, Larry Sutherland, in Columbus, Kansas. Sutherland's father became the first true figure of authority in Rader's life. He worked as the town's sheriff, and Rader recalled that he carried himself with the confident swagger of Clint Eastwood in his spaghetti western days. He also looked up to his cousin Larry, who was 5 years his senior, as the older brother he never had. Larry was a bright kid, and the 2 of them would often build model airplanes together and fantasize about one day becoming pilots. Rader claimed to have heard his parents speak about an incident that occurred one sweltering summer afternoon on Sutherland Farm in hushed tones. Larry was allegedly swimming with another friend in a pond on the family property. At some point during that afternoon, Larry Sutherland disappeared beneath the water and never returned to the surface. Rader was 13 at the time. The boy's body was allegedly later found floating just below the surface of the water. For the rest of his days, whenever Rader revisited the pages of his journal, he always stumbled back to that memory, How, he wondered, could someone be so nonchalant about the death of another human being? In his later interviews with the police, trying to find the roots of his actions, this is what he always went back to: the fact that he never had any feelings about that incident. Despite the fact that it was his own cousin, the boy who he looked up to and built model airplanes with. It puzzled him. The Rader family moved from the parental grandparents' home in a 3-bedroom house in the 4300 block of North Seneca Street. Despite being located on the northwestern edge of town, the neighborhood had a fairly rural feel to it. Rader hung out with a close-knit group of nearly a dozen kids. When school let out, they could often be found walking home together and exploring the sandy banks of the Little Arkansas River, which snaked its way through town. Rader's family bought their first TV set in 1955, when Rader was around 10 years old. The Rader boys loved watching the Mickey Mouse Club. Growing up in Wichita, Rader had an interest in novels, comic books, fishing and Cub Scouting. By the time 3rd grade rolled around, no one was surprised when he was picked to play Joseph for the Riverview Grade School's Christmas play. School was boring, he wrote, probably because it took him away from his fantasies. Although he possessed a vivid imagination, he never quite figured out how to put it to use in school. He did fairly well in mathematics, but no matter how hard he tried, he could never get his mind around his English classes. Rader did the minimum amount of work necessary for him to slide through school. He'd often sit there in class, half asleep, allowing himself to be pulled away to all those places he fantasized about. No one really paid attention to him back there. And he got the biggest kick out of watching how his teachers would come unglued when one of his fellow students slipped up and got caught nodding off in class. He loved how it would cause the teachers to smash their rulers down on the offending student's desk. Despite telling himself that he was bored out of his wits, Rader wrote that he always plastered a perpetually attentive, serious look on his face, as if he were following every word the teacher uttered. He wrote that one of his favorite pastimes was to stick the tip of his pencil through the middle of a ruler and spin it around like a propeller. Something about the spinning motion lulled and calmed him. The young Dennis Rader fit in well with the simple, don't-rock-the-boat sensibility so prevalent in Kansas's largest city in the 1950s. By the time he was 9 years old, his friends said he wasn't much of anything other than a quiet kid who seemed to have a knack for never standing out. His personality was so predictably even-keeled that many of his classmates at Wichita Heights High School wrote him off as hopelessly boring. He was one of that rare breed of youth who often caused the parents of other kids in his neighborhood to exclaim, "Why can't you be like Dennis Rader?" In junior high, he developed an obsessive and violent crush on America's newest teen sweetheart, Annette Funicello. He longed to drive out to California, kidnap her, and tie her up in ropes, he said. Not at all weird for a predictably even-keeled kid. From a young age, Rader harbored sadistic sexual fantasies centered on controlling, trapping, and torturing helpless women. As a child and teenager, he began acting out these fetishes privately. He engaged in voyeurism by spying on female neighbors, and he would frequently cross-dress using women's clothing and underwear that he stole. He combined these elements with autoerotic asphyxiation, using ropes and bindings on himself to simulate being trapped. But this was a private occurrence, and nobody knew until he mentioned it years later in police interviews. In 8th grade, his father gave him a bit of advice about how to handle those clowns who seemed hell-bent on picking a fight. William showed his son how to punch and where to aim his blows. It wasn't long after that the class bully set his sights on him. Rader matched the kid blow for blow, and nobody else ever picked on Rader again. One night, when everyone was lined up in front of the cafeteria for lunch, the school's biggest jock butted in front of Rader and his buddies. Rader tapped the guy on the shoulder and informed him that he didn't like the jocks cutting in front of him. Rader didn't have a mean look and never raised his voice, but the interloper apologized and walked to the back of the line. Rader would also do the same thing to anyone who bothered his youngest brother, Paulie. He couldn't stomach the thought of other kids harassing Paulie because of his size. He would stare unblinkingly into a foe's eyes and say, "I don't appreciate you teasing Paulie. You need to stop now, or I'm going to have to do something about it." Rader also loved being scared. On Friday nights, he and his buddies would see who could stand being scared the most by horror movies and shows like The Host and Rodney. Originally titled Nightmare, The Host and Rodney was a pioneering, late-night local horror host television program broadcast out of Wichita, Kansas. The show revolved around the comedic and creepy interactions between its two titular characters during commercial breaks of classic monster movies, played by Wichita television legend Tom Leahy Jr., who also wrote the scripts, built the sets, and did his own makeup. The Host was a pompous, grandiloquent, and delightfully sinister intellectual. The Host's monster-like assistant, Rodney, played by Lee Parsons, was simple, childlike, and communicated largely through guttural noises, yet he frequently managed to outsmart or rebel against the Host's arrogant plans. First hitting the airwaves on KAKE-TV on January 31st, 1958, it is remembered as one of the very first homegrown horror host shows in the United States. Like most kids in the region at that time, Dennis was glued to the television for it. However, rather than a fun, shared social experience with friends, Rader's fascination with the show was deeply solitary and dark. Rader later admitted in interviews and confessions that he was obsessed with the horror movies and local host segments. Instead of being normally scared, the macabre imagery, elements of entrapment in classic horror films, and the dark themes deeply fed into the violent, sadomasochistic fantasies he was already developing as a young teenager. That childhood viewing routine sparked a lifelong twisted fixation on KAK-TV. Decades later, when he began his murder spree as BTK, KAK-TV became his preferred media outlet. He targeted the station specifically, sending them multiple taunting letters, poems, and clues to mock the police and demand national attention. In horror films, the monster or the villain is often defined by a mask or a physical transformation. For Rader, wearing a mask wasn't just a practical way to hide his face from victims, it was actually a psychological trigger. Tom Leahy put on makeup to become the Host, and Rader put on his female masks, leather masks, or Xeroxed faces of his victims to become BTK. The mask allowed him to step out of his boring, inadequate reality as Dennis Rader and step into the omnipotent, terrifying character he created in his mind. While studying at Wichita Heights High School, Rader spent most of his out-of-school time working as a bag boy and shelf stocker for a local grocery store to earn money for a motor vehicle. He put in long hours at Leaker's Family Foods, trying to save up enough money for a car. Working was hardly a sacrifice, as deep down he never felt particularly comfortable hanging out with the other kids. He only did that to blend in and not be the loner weirdo. It didn't work every time, though. Dennis once played Linus Van Pelt, the character famous for carrying a security blanket in a production of You're a Good Man, Charlie Brown. Not a good resume for a tough guy wannabe, and he got mocked several times by his friends about it. One night he missed a turn in the road while driving his parents' 58th Plymouth station wagon, careening over a dirt embankment and plunging into a shallow ditch. Rader was hysterical and wailing about the wreck, failing to mention anything about his injured friend. Another red flag added to his insensibility collection. He also had a hobby of making a fake train whistle sound when they were on the tracks. That was enough to make the hair on the back of everyone's neck stand straight up. He'd roar with laughter over the panic he glimpsed on the faces of his pals. He was weird like that, but his friends accepted him anyway. Everyone had a thing, and this was his. Sometimes at night, Rader and a buddy would drive out to the city dump and blast rats with their .22s. They'd sit there in the darkness, waiting for the city's vermin to delude themselves that all was safe. Rader was good at the waiting part. He could sit for a long time doing nothing, just stalking in the dark, waiting for a damn rat to poke its head out of the hole. They spent hours in the car talking about what they are going to do in life. He told his buddies he wanted to be a rocket scientist when he got older, and one of his friends said that by the time high school was finishing up, Dennis was contemplating becoming a game warden. Rader was active in Boy Scouts. He liked the structure of the organization and the order and predictability it provided. Scouting allowed him to put his fascination with string and bindings to use, especially when it came to learning how to tie knots. His favorite was the clove hitch alongside the square knot and the bowline. The clove hitch eventually became his strangler knot. While he used different knots in subsequent crimes, such as a standard granny knot, the clove hitch was a distinct part of his early methodology. He was always prepared, meticulously planning in advance for every event, every trip, and every aspect of his life. One summer, Rader traveled to New Mexico's Philmont Scout Ranch and went on a 50-mile hiking expedition. He insisted on bringing a pack filled with nearly 70 pounds of gear, far above the 45-pound requirement. This directly translated into what he called his hit kits later in life. When he committed his murders, he carried briefcase-sized kits, meticulously packed with multiple types of ropes, bonds, masks, and weapons. After graduating in 1963, Rader attended Kansas Wesleyan University in Salina. He received only mediocre grades and dropped out after 1 year. Because his parents could afford only a portion of the tuition, Rader was constantly strapped for cash. He would drive 90 miles back to Wichita in order to work his old job at Leakers, always earning just enough to barely get him through. Before long, he began sneaking around at night and jimmying open soda machines and stealing the pop bottles to collect the deposit money. His stint at Kansas Wesleyan did help him acquire how to be an extrovert. He joined a fraternity and quickly became a regular fixture at the beer parties around campus. For the first time in his life, he began consciously constructing a cover for himself that was far different than the one he'd assumed back in his hometown. He transformed himself into something of a third-rate Midwestern bon vivant. He summoned enough nerve to ask out a few of the Wesleyan co-eds. This third-rate Midwestern bon vivant persona became the foundation for the double life he would lead for the next 3 decades. It allowed him to successfully blend into his community as a husband, father, Cub Scout leader, and church council president, completely concealing the violent fantasies and meticulous planning occurring just beneath the surface. Rader joined the United States Air Force on August 17, 1966. He completed basic training at Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio, Texas. In October, he was sent to Shepherd Air Force Base in Wichita Falls, Texas, where he attended technical school, specializing in radio communications. After technical school, he worked as an antenna installer and maintenance specialist. He was stationed at Brookley Air Force Base in Mobile, Alabama, followed by assignments in Turkey, Greece, and South Korea. Rader was then transferred to Japan in January 1968, where he spent 6 months stationed at Kadena Air Base in Okinawa, followed by 25 months stationed at Tachikawa Airfield in Tokyo. He earned a medal for good conduct and a ribbon for marksmanship. He also earned a National Defense Service Medal because his service coincided with the military being under a state of emergency due to the Vietnam War. Rader received an honorable discharge on August 12, 1970, at the rank of Staff Sergeant, and he subsequently served in the Air Force Reserve Command until June 20, 1972. Shortly after Rader returned to Wichita, following his 4-year hitch in the Air Force, his mother said, "You need to come to church with me. I met a nice girl there who I think you'd like." Her name was Paula Dietz, and she'd graduated from Wichita Heights High School in 1966. The two began dating, and on May 22, 1971, Rader married Paula Dietz in a ceremony held at Christ Lutheran Church. His bride was working as a secretary at the VA hospital. For the ceremony, 2 of his 3 younger brothers stood up with him. He appeared to adore Paula. People noticed that his voice and posture grew softer every time he spoke of her. A year after his discharge, Rader purchased a home in Park City, Kansas, a suburb of Wichita. The family's Park City residence was a 900-square-foot ranch-style home, and they moved in May 1977. Prior to that, they lived in apartments in Wichita. Rader initially worked in the meat department of an IGA supermarket, where his mother was employed as a bookkeeper. From mid-1972 to mid-1973, he worked as an assembler for Coleman, where 2 of his victims, Julie Otero and Catherine Bright, also worked. Julie Otero was a worker on an assembly line at the Coleman Company from the middle of December 1973 until January 3, 1974. Catherine Bright worked as a metal brazier until March 11, 1974, and as an assembler after that. By the summer of 1973, he was working on the assembly line at the Cessna Aircraft Company. But in November 1973, he learned that he and about 500 other workers had been sacked from Cessna due to the oil crisis. In 1973, Rader earned an associate degree in electronics engineering from Butler County Community College in El Dorado, Kansas. This specific degree is what gave him the technical credentials to get hired by ADT Security Services in 1974. Rader's most significant employment was as an alarm technician and installation supervisor for ADT Security Services. He used the technical skills he acquired in the Air Force to install residential and commercial security systems. This job gave him direct access to people's homes, layout blueprints, and personal information, allowing him to easily scout potential victims without drawing suspicion. His co-workers noted he was incredibly meticulous, earning the nickname Blue Bookman for his rigid adherence to company policy manuals. Business was good because a wave of terror swept through the Wichita area at that time. People were terrified, and local homeowners rushed to buy home security systems to protect themselves from the notorious BTK killer. Because Rader worked for ADT Security Services during this exact window, from 1974 to 1988, he was literally the man sent to install those alarms. He walked into the homes of frightened citizens, looked at their floor plans, installed the wiring, and explained how the security systems worked. He got to listen to his customers talk about how terrified they were of BTK, completely unaware that the killer was standing right in their living room. He then attended Wichita State University and graduated in 1979 with a Bachelor of Science degree, majoring in Administration of Justice. William Rader, who worked for 37 years for the local utility Kansas Gas and Electric, retired in August 1985. Dorothea Rader worked for 26 years as a bookkeeper at Leaker's Family Foods Grocery and retired in January 1986. She was a gentle person appreciated by her neighbors and others who knew her. After leaving ADT, Rader worked briefly for the U.S. Census Bureau. As a census taker, his job required him to visit various residences to collect information, which once again afforded him a legitimate excuse to knock on doors, interact with the public, and observe the interiors and surroundings of local homes. In 1991, Dennis Rader took a job as a compliance supervisor and code enforcement officer for the Wichita suburb of Park City. Because his duties included animal control, locals frequently referred to him as the town's dog catcher. He held this position for over a decade, right up until his arrest in February 2005. In his role as a compliance officer, Rader gained a reputation among Park City residents as a petty tyrant and an extreme stickler for the rules. He was notorious for measuring the exact height of people's lawns with a tape measure to issue citations and aggressively pursuing minor neighborhood infractions. The position essentially gave him legal authority to control, monitor, and dominate his neighbors, feeding the same psychological need for omnipotence that drove his crimes. Neighbors reported that he was unnecessarily harsh and took a visible, disturbing pleasure in capturing and euthanizing local pets. In one instance, he infamously euthanized a neighbor's dog simply because it had wandered onto his own property. Dennis Rader and his wife Paula had 2 children, a son, Brian, born in 1975, and a daughter, Kerry, born in 1978. Both grew up completely unaware of their father's secret life, experiencing him as a normal, involved, though sometimes rigidly strict dad. When Rader was arrested in February 2005, their lives were completely shattered. The police actually used DNA from Kerry's medical records at Kansas State University to definitively link Rader to the BTK murders. Kerry has been the most public about her experience, becoming a well-known author and activist for crime victims. She spoke extensively about the psychological toll of the revelation, describing a decade of rotting inside with severe anxiety, depression, and PTSD after realizing her childhood memories were used as a cover for a monster. Kerry was recruited by law enforcement to visit her father at the El Dorado Correctional Facility, to interview him regarding unsolved cold cases and missing persons in the Midwest, attempting to use their relationship to get him to confess to other crimes. Unlike his sister, Brian has chosen to remain strictly out of the public eye and rarely spoke to the media. At the time of his father's arrest, Brian was serving in the US Navy as a crew member on a submarine, which really destabilized his life when the news broke. According to his family, he quietly focused on building a private life, dealing with the immense trauma away from the spotlight. Kerry occasionally mentioned him respectfully in interviews, saying that he is doing well, but understandably values his privacy. Dennis Rader's wife, Paula Dietz, was completely unaware of his secret identity for nearly 34 years. She knew him as a dedicated family man, a church council president, and an involved father to their 2 children. Paula did not stand by him. In June 2005, Rader pleaded guilty to the 10 murders, and by July 2005, a judge granted Paula an immediate emergency divorce on the grounds of mental cruelty. Rader did not contest it. After the divorce, Paula immediately moved out of Kansas to escape the intense media scrutiny. She chose to completely retreat from the public eye to heal and process the trauma privately. Dennis Rader was a deeply involved member of the Christ Lutheran Church in Park City, Kansas. He maintained a 30-year affiliation with the congregation and held multiple prominent leadership roles, most notably serving as the president of the church council at the time of his arrest in February 2005. Rader climbed the ranks of the church hierarchy to become the congregation's council president. In this administrative role, he was responsible for leading council meetings, managing church business, coordinating with the pastor, and helping oversee the day-to-day operations and governance of the church. Beyond his administrative title, Rader was highly visible to ordinary churchgoers. He regularly volunteered as an usher, welcoming people to services, passing out bulletins, and collecting the weekly offering plates. He also looked after church property, assisted with cleanups, and prepared the facilities for events. Rader used his respected standing in the church as the ultimate shield for his mask of sanity, believing no one would ever suspect a devout, soft-spoken church president of being a serial killer. However, his church role directly led to his capture. In January 2005, Rader sent a package to the police containing a letter asking a direct question: could he communicate via a floppy disk without it being traced back to a specific computer? He specifically directed this inquiry to the lead investigator of the BTK task force, Wichita Police Lieutenant Ken Landwehr, with whom he mistakenly believed he shared a special rapport. Landwehr naturally lied to him. The police placed a deceptive classified ad in the Wichita Eagle newspaper that read, "Rex, it will be okay," reassuring Rader that a floppy disk was an untraceable, secure way to communicate. Believing the police's lie, Rader prepared a text file on a purple 1.44 megabyte floppy disk to mail to a local television station. However, to physically create and print documents, he utilized the resources at his church, Christ Lutheran Church. In January, Rader approached his pastor, Michael Clark, with the floppy disk. He told the pastor that he had the agenda for an upcoming church council meeting saved on the disk and needed to run off some physical copies on the church's printer. Pastor Clark, thinking it was just a routine administrative request from his trusted church council president, obliged and let Rader use the computer to print his materials. What Rader didn't realize was that when he used the church computer, the Microsoft Word software automatically embedded hidden metadata onto the disk, but it was easily recovered using the forensic software Encase. When he later mailed that same disk to KSAS-TV, the local Fox affiliate, forensic investigators easily extracted the deleted metadata. The hidden data contained two crucial pieces of information. The file had last been modified at Christ Lutheran Church, and the user who made the last edit was named Dennis. From that point, it took investigators only 9 days to look up the church, see that the council president was a man named Dennis Rader, quietly acquire a matching DNA sample, and arrest him. When Rader was interrogated and realized how he had been caught, he was genuinely shocked and asked Landwehr, "I need to ask you, Ken, how come you lied to me?" Landwehr coolly responded, "Because I was trying to catch you."